Art, do you remember what
Say that again.
Martin Luther King's quote in there? I didn't write it down and I loved it. And I can't remember what it was.
About the heart.
Yeah, about his heart and mind. It was great. I will put it.
I can return to it at the end if we want to. Yeah. Well, where are you this week?
I grew up Catholic, so this was very relevant to kindergarten through 8th grade. I was in Catholic school through the 8th grade. And so all those were just basic, absolutely bottom line about what we learned over 8 years. It was repeated in a different way. The language may have changed a little bit, but for the most part, he was just re-quoting what I learned in Catholic school for 8 years. And that's not a bad thing. It was very refreshing. It was like I was back in Catholic school with the Sisters of the Divine Providence going, yes, sister, no, sister. It was really, to me, it's very touching and very beautiful because it's very basic to me, my heart.
Thank you.
You know, I think that we are seeing the evolution of our understanding of God. And I'm amazed at how he kind of figuring things out as we go along. And I don't know how they do it because I can't get into their minds. But it's fascinating to see that transition go. There's a book called something about when Jesus became man or something like that, and it was the story of the Nicene Creed and how they figured out that Jesus was both man and God instead of the separate.
How Jesus became God, I think. That's
yeah.
by Bart Ehrman from Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
Provocative title.
How Jesus became God.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else with your thoughts from the readings manual or video that are just immediately on your head here when we talk about your theme is God personal?
I do have a little bit of a problem establishing what people call a personal relationship with God. I can understand God, but I've never been able to figure out how to develop a personal relationship with God. It seems to me to be kind of beyond me right now.
Would you say more about that?
Well, I guess I see him as more of an impersonal God than personal God. He created the universe. He set us all up. He gave us the capability to love and to nurture. But I don't particularly see him. I don't pray to God for this or for that. I pray for thankfulness. But I communicate with him, but I'm not sure I get any communication back.
Does anybody want to have a reaction to that? My immediate thought, if it's okay to say, is my brain gets overloaded with, and it's not right or wrong, but I often get overloaded thinking God has this very personal relationship with me, and I want to do job A. And God has this very personal relationship with Herb, and Herb wants to do job B. how is God going to work out between A and B? I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying. And particularly when you think about prayers, right? Like supplications. There's no doubt on election day, lots of people are praying for their candidate to win. Like, what does God do with that?
Yeah, I don't think he does anything with it.
Well, most of the time, because I can't sort that out, I sort of think, well, that's just not a thing God does, right? And like when people say, pray for the Astros. What kind of prayer? That they play a fair, honest game? That they win? Does God care who wins a ball game? I mean, if God's personal, yes. Personal like we are, because look, like my wife, there are many things I do she has no interest in whatsoever, but because she cares about me, she does care. How to hold all of that together that's tough for me. And I don't know if that's kind of what you're.
Yeah, I can't, I don't see him, no. I mean, sure, I prayed that Alvarez hit that home run last night, but I mean, I don't think God had anything to do with that.
Yeah. And when does praying become different? How is praying different from wishing?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think praying, when we do the prayers of people, we acknowledge that there are hopes for the people, for the affairs, the events that we pray for. But I'm not sure that prayer goes up to God and God says, well, okay, I'll do this and that and that and that. I think our prayers are recognition that there are inequities in the world, and we hope that those get somehow resolved. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I just want to make sure I hear what you're saying. Like, and the prayers of the people particularly do call out a lot of social situations, and that's their intent, right? Is that they don't say, God bless the Astros. They say, hey, for the dignity of every human being, mentor and guide elected officials throughout the world, right? Like they're of that ilk more than they are like wishing. And, you know, there is an interesting tendency though, like, God, there's a lot of children going to starve this week. You should do something about it. Oh, you know, Tim, I hadn't thought about that. But now that you've said it,
Right.
I think maybe I'll allow fewer children to starve this week. It's a little bit funny to think of it working like that, but in some ways, we act like it works that way because that's what we do.
And it seems superficially a little superficial kind of, because it's God you're talking about. It's going to be you're looking over all of it. And he has a power to do whatever, but on the other hand, the earth also works, and every individual makes their own. Hitler still exists, or Hitler's like people that still exist. You know, the Ukraine is still having trouble with the Russians, and people die for meaningless reasons. I don't know, maybe I'm going in circles or something, but it's a lot of stuff.
And if it says somewhere in the Bible, he knew you before you were born. So if he knows what's going to happen, then how is that a prayer?
It almost comes down to that free will versus God's will kind of argument people pose a lot. I feel like there are people out there that in certain religions that are just like, you know, this is God's will, that it was done like that, you know, that he knew what your beginnings and ends were before you made any choices whatsoever. That's it.
I like the reading when it said God's accessible but not manageable. not to be controlled. Yeah, and if you think about that, that made me stop and think. But in prayer life, a lot of times I will say something that's really bothering me in the world or a social situation, and then follow it up with, what can I do? What can I personally do to make this better? Give me some guidance. And so when I talk to God sometimes, I'm not asking him to control it. I'm just saying, if there's something this is bothering me, if there's something I can do, show me.
So that's a way of negotiating the free will and God's will,
Yeah.
right? Like maintaining both. I can do something, so God give me a good idea here.
Yeah.
Or give me the strength
Or the
Yeah.
strength.
to do what I need to do.
Yeah. You know, and I probably shared with you this before, like it becomes interesting sometimes in the niche cases. Those are the things that help you reshape the big ones. One of my experiences in Coronado was with this 4-star admiral who got up and delivered this very scathing critique of drone warfare. He sort of said, look, if you're going to kill a human being, you should do that, not vicariously 5,000 miles away, because you're so disconnected. It's like a video game now, and it's not like intervening in somebody's life yourself. It's a little interesting because he was a fighter pilot and he shot people from a plane, and there's no way he saw their face. But it was interesting that he talked about it, right? And what he said when he was in Vietnam as an aviator, he he said, I knew that shooting these people was essentially morally wrong, but it was my duty as an American soldier, right? So I forget, I think he came up with this line. So I never asked God to forgive me. I never asked for that because I was going to go do it again tomorrow. But he did ask for the strength to do what I had to do. It's a sort of interesting to parse that out, right? Don't ask God to forgive you for something you know you're going to do again. Hey, number one, that was an interesting thought. And so when you know you're going to do it again, it's not forgiveness you want, it's ability to do what you think is important, even if it's a moral conflict. I don't know, this kind of stuff I think is the interesting exceptions that come back to the rule, right? And part of what he said, just so that I don't think this is tangential at all, I think it's exactly what we're supposed to be talking about. All of these councils have had to do with this gesture. I don't know if you've seen the Pope do this. The Pope blesses people like this. This is Orthodox Christianity. There's the three wounds, there's the Trinity, which is one. There's the two natures of Jesus, and there's the 5 wounds on his body. So the gesture is supposed to have all of those things. And this is Orthodox Western Christianity, the 2 natures. So I don't know if you know that there's non-Orthodox Christianities, like in Ethiopia. Ethiopian Christianity is called heterodox or heretical because it's monophysite, as in Jesus has one nature. He's God who looked like a human. Or it went the other way around. If you were a Docetist around the time of Constantine, Jesus seemed to be God, but he was just a person, right? Because this is a hard thing to hold on to. And I think this comes back to prayer and everything else, right? The thing we got to hear is fully human, fully divine, neither compromised, neither will compromise. Well, that's hard to imagine, isn't it? So Jesus wanted human stuff, more cake than he should eat. He wanted that. And then the divine will, well, I don't know if God cares about cake. I actually don't know. But the divine will wanted peace on earth or whatever it is. And Jesus was thinking about cake. And there was no tension between those things.
Well, you see, that's where I get really hung up is that say God wanted an extra piece of cake and it wasn't good for him, or an extra glass of wine. I mean, how can a person be totally human and not be challenged for love or for anything else. And then, I mean, I can't reconcile that within my own mind.
Well, the scripture doesn't even try to help us. Let's just be
No.
honest. Once upon a time, this foreign lady comes up to Jesus and says, my daughter's sick. Could you help her? And he says, I don't give children's food to bitches.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what he says to female dogs. Well, I can see the humanity in that. The divinity is hard to find, right? Because like racial and gender slurs do not seem to like coexist with God's nature and will in my head. The only reconciliation I can do is the lady says, yeah, but even bitches get crumbs. And Jesus says, hey, that's a great point. I'll heal your daughter. So like the only way I can figure out is the divine will is that Jesus learns from her. And that's also the human part, right? Humanity at our best, we learn, and divinity at our best, we learn.
Right.
But I think if you pause in the middle of a story and you don't have that conclusion, I don't know what you do with that story. Like, where does it come out? You know, like, again, I can tell after the end of a story arc, I can do some like, okay, here's what was happening in the divine world and the human world. But if you stop in the middle and you don't have the conclusion, it's a lot harder to find the divinity or the humanity sometimes.
Yeah, because if he was divine, then he would already have the answer.
And would know better than to call the lady a racial slur,
Yeah.
if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, I want to make sure you hear, you can bristle at the word, but I'm just quoting the scriptures to you.
Yeah.
So I'm not like, oh, he didn't call her that. He called her a female dog. I just want to be clear, we have a word for that in English, and it's the one that I used. And it's becomes interesting, right? Because, you know, again, like, depends how you grew up. I grew up real like fundamentalist. We didn't use profanity, but the Apostle Paul uses profanity all over the place. It's just that the translators didn't want you to see that because they didn't think you should do it. But it's there. That's the interesting thing.
You know, culturally, I grew up Hispanic, South Texas, and there were words that adults used that we heard them, that we were not allowed to use in Spanish, and primarily in Spanish. And you couldn't say that. And we all knew they weren't, because we heard our adults use them. And that's so such mixed messages, right?
Yeah.
And you know, if you got said that word or whatever, te ibas a hincar, te ibas a rezar, go kneel down and pray.
Yeah.
And your grandmother would put her hand on your head and say a little prayer for you to forgive you for your sins. And I mean, it was actually, in some ways, it was very sweet.
Yes.
But at the same time, the other flip side of it was like, what a mixed up message you're
Well,
getting here.
and so you've created this perfect segue for us to do what the workbook did, right? On the one hand, and the workbook doesn't fully introduce this tension. On the one hand, God is personal enough to have a name like you and I have a name. And God's name isn't God, just to be really clear, that God has this name in Hebrew that is like K or her. Well, that's just what people use. No, the scriptures are clear, like that is God's name, period, forever. And yet, our Jewish brothers and sisters refuse to say that word. So it's personal, and God has this personal name, but you can't say it. And if you write it, you have to do ritual purification because you've defiled yourself. And the paper can't be thrown away. It has to be burned or buried like a dead body when you're done, which is why our Jewish brothers and sisters carry the scriptures on rods so that they don't touch the paper. And nobody touches the Torah scroll because it's got God's name written on it. So personal and dangerous. Sort of an interesting tension, isn't it? And the rabbis say you can never say God's name because it's too holy for you, A. B, if you ever said it right, the world would end because it's that strong, God's identity and name. C, you can't say it, but it's what's keeping you alive right now because you're breathing, which is kind of what it sounds like. Now, talk about paradox, right? You can't say or write it, but you're saying it right now or you'd be dead.
What happened to the guys that did write it?
Well, they do ritual purification. This still
Yeah,
happens
right
now.
after
So if
that.
you're like, if you're a rabbi copying the Torah, you'll do this like once a year, and somebody will pay $40,000 for somebody to copy out the Torah. So you'll write it, but
So then you.
at danger to you get, it's like a hazard pay situation. And it's not that you have to say like, God, I'm sorry I wrote it. It's that like, hey, the reason I did this was to maintain the Torah which you gave us.
Yeah,
And I also know that I've exposed myself to something that is like so metaphysically powerful, it could be dangerous to me. So there's this interesting balance. It's holy to do it, people need it, and there's big risk involved.
So why would makes no sense if God would make it so dangerous to say his name?
Well, it's super interesting you say that because there's a story we didn't read where David is taking the ark back to Jerusalem. The Philistines took it. It's on a cart and he's moving it to where he thinks God wants to live. Now, the ark is the thing God stands on, and the instructions are clear. Don't touch it, right? It's too holy for you to touch. So the priests put poles in it and they therefore don't directly touch it. The pole does, right? Well, the ark is going to fall off a cart. It's really clear. It's going to fall. And that would like be profane, right? And it would damage it. Because after all, it's a wood box with gold leaf. It's not solid gold or anything, right? So sure enough, this faithful guy sees the ark tottering and stabilizes it. It doesn't fall. You would think that's a tremendous religious duty, and he dies instantly. And maybe he just dies and God's not angry. But that's what happens when you touch a thermonuclear device, right? Like you could touch it for really great reasons. The radiation's still going to kill you. Right. This is tough stuff to balance, right?
but then Christians will sit there and write God's name.
It's
Yeah,
abhorrent to me, Jan. Actually,
Huh?
it's abhorrent.
Yeah,
There's like praise and worship songs
yeah,
that like have that name on like replay again and again and again. And I guess you can say like, oh, we have a personal relationship with God, so like we can
We
kind
can
of do
do
whatever
this.
we want to. Maybe, but that's not how like that's not the tradition we came from.
yeah.
Our Jewish brothers and sisters would find it absolutely abhorrent for
Yeah.
you to write or say this name. They would. So I don't understand the utility of it. I think it's helpful to hear to like have some understanding of it, right? Like
Yeah.
what the book tries to do, to give you some understanding, but without understanding like, hey, like with great intimacy also comes really strong boundaries and respect.
Mhm.
There are things I would never say to my spouse because I respect her too much, even if the feelings are real. I think that's the personal and the divine coming together, right?
Yeah.
Honesty sometimes submits to respect. And that's probably truth. Saying something because it's factual doesn't make it true.
Yeah, I thought, we had a pastor here who always said, love trumps truth. I didn't know what he was talking about until, I finally understood it. That a loving thought always trumps the truth.
Say that again. It trumps truth.
Truth. By which I think her means facts. So
Yeah.
truth, capital T,
Okay.
cannot exist without love. So if there's a fact pattern,
Okay.
it's true with a small t, but if it's not expressed in love, it's not true with a capital T.
An example, you know, you can tell somebody, I've got to be honest, but you're ugly. You know, well, that's not love, it's not very loving, right?
Right.
And it may be truthful, you know, or pick one that's not subject, there's some things that aren't subjective, you know, beauty may be, but you still don't say those to people. So you always said love trumps truth. And there are a lot of ways to think about that. You know, sometimes we go, well, I just got to get this off my chest, you know. Well, maybe you don't need to, you know.
It's better kept
So
on
that you
your
can
chest.
lay it on mine?
Exactly. That's what we're doing often.
Yeah.
Can play some games with that from the standpoint of talking about something the person is wearing rather than the person themselves or something. So then you're separating, but then on the one hand, somebody'd say, well, no, but that dress, she chose that dress. She went and bought it herself and paid her, you know, so that's tricky and difficult.
Well, and so that becomes a really interesting thought to me, connected to like personal God, is to think about how relative beauty is.
Yes.
Because I could show you a picture of the most beautiful person in the world, and I don't think we'd all agree. Based on what? Based on our internalized proportions or the projections we have about our own body or the ones our parents or movies or media have given us, right? So God can find people I perceive to be ugly rather beautiful. That seems to be the personal part. And I think by extension, going back to last week, right? All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, sure. But what about the squat and ugly things? Like the naked mole rat, nature's cruelest mistake. Well, I suppose I have to entertain a headspace where the personal God finds the naked mole rat exquisite, along with the mosquito. And if you don't mind me saying, like the goiter. Goiters are scary to me. It's like that growth
Like
on your
it's-
neck,
Yeah.
right? Kay is more of a physician than I am. Suffice it to say, it's a neck tumor. And if you saw someone with a giant neck tumor, you'd probably cringe because you'd be faced with your own mortality.
And it's also like, for example, if you are approached, in your car and you're approached by a homeless guy, I mean, sometimes there's a sense of panic, so I want to make sure the door is locked and putting those up. Because they're different. But they're all part of the word of God.
Yeah.
So, you know, they have to be accepted. And how we do that, I think, is the Bible tends to show us the way to do that.
And does God care about bunnies?
Yes.
Does God find bunnies like exquisitely beautiful and lovely?
Well, he created them.
They're very
there.
good, right?
They're there. they're
Bunnies
good.
are pretty easy to like. They're pretty
Yeah.
innocuous things, right? I mean, they do poop everywhere, but otherwise, like they're pretty sweet things.
Yeah.
Does God care about wolves? Wolves are pretty majestic looking, right?
Yes.
Or armadillos.
Well, I wanted to stick with wolves and bunnies
Because the wolf.
because God made wolves to eat bunnies. And God loves both things, finds both things exquisite and beautiful, and one's a predator and one's prey. Where's the divine and human will in those two?
So how are we supposed to understand that?
Well, I'm not trying to teach you a lesson. I'm trying to hold up a difficulty. right? And I think the difficulty is in maintaining a personal relationship, but not necessarily engineering things, events, because of the personal relationship.
And then there's the whole idea to me of evil. God created Hitler. And he was a person created by God, if you,
Mhm.
but yet look at the things he did, and that's just an example. There are other evil people like that, but.
And he sure thought he was doing the right thing. I would even guarantee you that.
Yes.
Oh,
I never
yes.
met the guy, but I think he thought he was doing the right thing. I guarantee it.
That's kind of what I was gonna say, that I think that God looks at inner beauty the same way as outer beauty too. You know, I think that he also sees what we might think is ugly inner beauty is still beautiful.
In our reading earlier, I can't remember where it was. Do y'all remember, I read a lot of extra things when I read this, so it may not be in here, but the original intent in the Garden of Eden was that all the animals got along, and it wasn't until the apple incident that they started eating each other.
I don't think we've read that. I've heard that, but it just doesn't jive with science, right? And the reason I say this is like the saber-toothed tiger was not using those fangs on melons. I mean, those teeth do one thing. They kill other mammals. So I grew up in Sunday school that the saber-toothed tiger used to be a vegetarian, but when the people ate the fruit, they grew fangs and they started eating. I'm not kidding. That's
Yeah,
what I
'cause
heard.
I've read that somewhere recently, yeah.
And
I've never heard it.
It's this lovely idea in some ways, but actually, like Isaiah says, that's the future, not the past, which I think is really interesting.
But the future will be when they.
In
lie
the
down
future, the
together.
wolf lies down with the lamb and they sleep together, not the wolf lies down with the lamb because it's eating it. But that isn't the past, says Isaiah. That's the future. And what's this weird thing is, at least the church I grew up in, is we decided, oh, that must have also been the past, so we must have messed everything up. But that just doesn't make sense to me scientifically. Like, this doesn't make sense. It could be the case, it's just not in the fossil record. The first people were clearly vegetarians. They ate pomegranates and figs and stuff. Sounds like a snack to me. Like, it's not super filling. You know, the fruit diet it's a fad diet, right? Because like you need other stuff like fats and proteins that you just don't get from the trees. Those trees. Maybe they were nuts. You know, maybe they were macadamia nuts, and I don't know.
Protein
Easy
somewhere.
to argue Hawaii was part of paradise. Okay, you can do that. But it's interesting to think about with both prayer and in the animal kingdom and standards of beauty, that God can in fact very personally find things beautiful and be present without simultaneously favoring anybody or engineering outcomes.
You know, that if you're a biologist and you know that these things have to be balanced, some things have to kill, or the balance goes away, and then the area cannot maintain the what's in it. And so there are just some things on the TV recently about, you know, trying to replace the balance of some of the lands that we want to look pretty and natural forever, you know. So I don't know, that would be God doing his job and making sure that everything worked out, I guess. I don't know.
I mean, actually, if you've seen the Marvel movies, The Avengers, that's the story arc, is restoring balance to the universe. And the thought is that we have overloaded the carrying capacity of the universe. So we can either all die, or half the population could die, and the other half to live a happy life with plenty of resources. Of course, the character who tries to do this is a villain, and his name is Death. His name is Death. Thanos is Death. I'm not comparing God to marble. But it's interesting when you start to think about, again, how do you maintain personal relationship with universal mechanisms? Have you ever like been in the middle of two people who were disagreeing, both of whom you loved, and you were able to see why they were doing what they were doing, even though you thought maybe there's a better way than this, and you were able to maintain friendships with both without trumping one or the other? I wonder if it's like that, but I'm not sure.
This is so good. I really enjoy.
Is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
it is
enjoying
good.
this. The study is just, I love it.
It's very thoughtful.
Yes, it makes you dig
Yeah.
deep.
Yes, it's very thoughtful. There are things I have to-
I know. Things I didn't know.
Yes.
In the film that we saw, there were 6 councils, 7 councils.
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
And each of them further defined the nature of Jesus. Were they inspired by God? I mean, how were they inspired to get to that conclusion? Yes, that's.
Or was it just they wanted their thoughts their way?
And they were trying to understand the Trinity.
Among other things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't answer that question. I mean, what's the objective answer to that?
I don't know. You know, was it a man-made concept or, I don't know. I'm just curious as to how they got from point A to point B and C.
Mhm.
I don't think there's an answer. But it's just interesting to travel along that path to see how they got there.
I think part of the reason those councils are so important is because they weren't decided by one person. They were ecumenical. So imagine, this is in a world that's like pre-denominational, right? That denominations really are the gift of the Reformations. But essentially imagine that you've got at the table a Roman Catholic, traditional Roman Catholic, straight white male, and then you've got a Mormon and a Southern Baptist and a liberal Quaker and an end times eschatologist who is reading Revelation with the newspaper in one hand. And then next to that person, you've got like a Black woman Christian who's a member of a church where it's dominated by Black men who don't even go to church. And then you've got somebody gay, and then you've got somebody pregnant, and you got somebody divorced, and you put all those people and they have to agree on something.
We call that
Sometimes
Congress.
Well, we do. And so actually, this is one of those, I think this is one of the metrics of inspiration.
Mhm.
I can't say that the Holy Spirit descended in a visual cloud that looked like glitter, because glitter is like evil and wrong. But like, so I don't know about that, but I can say, wow, there's something really inspiring about 20 inherently polarized viewpoints signing on the dotted line that we hold these things in common. That's pretty inspiring, actually, to me. I actually prefer that people choose to do that than that God pushes them to do it. Does that make sense what I'm saying? If God intervened, then I have a lot less respect for the council, because I know how hard some of my opinions are to change. And so to imagine that people willingly change their opinions for the sake of unity, it's pretty inspiring.
Like being on a jury, you know, trying to decide something.
Mhm.
And you have to talk it out and change somebody's mind.
Right. And hopefully people are open to listening to each other
Mhm.
and they don't think that they're like divine inspiration is just saying no because it's different.
I'm ready to go home.
It's interesting to, sorry,
Well, I was just thinking, if there's something bigger at stake, survival, for example, I mean, if you were a group of people, you're not judging one other person, but rather, I don't know, in the middle of some place where you had to survive together and you had to cooperate and you had to work together and gosh, I mean, say that all of us were in a place like that. I mean, we don't even know each other that well. How would, that's, and in some ways, that's the way the humanity, the world is, and it doesn't work out all the time. I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling, but it's just made me think.
Better get Putin on board.
What?
Better get Putin on board.
well, and I would tell you,
Yeah.
Putin wishes we would get on board.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my
Yes.
mind, he thinks what he's doing is the right thing
Oh,
for him to do.
No question.
Because consider how inconvenient it is for him personally. This is really inconvenient. But he's committed to it. He has faith.
But it's most inconvenient for the people
rest
from
of the
Ukraine.
And it's inconvenient for us as well.
Yes, but we're not putting our lives on the line.
And
No,
does
you're
our
right.
convenience dictate what's right or wrong?
Yeah, because we're putting his life online saying he needs to go.
Yeah,
At least our leadership is.
it's sort of like telling China and India they should not be using fossil fuels in such extreme measure because it's bad for the planet. We did that for 200 years so that we could get to the top of the hierarchy. And now that we're there, we don't need that anymore.
Yes,
Same thing with the atom bomb. We were the first ones that used it.
But now no one else can.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't get, well, we were the first ones who used a nuclear device on human beings,
yes.
but no one else can do it because it was bad. But we did it twice, to be clear, not once.
Yes.
Got it.
Thank you, just.
And what's interesting is the personal God seems to only work really with other human beings. Moses, I've seen, and I want you to go. Why don't you do that? You're going. This is like an interesting thing, isn't it? Right? Like God doesn't just undo chains from on high. Or that God chooses to work with us instead of overcoming us, right? Like when slavery ends in Egypt, it's not because God just sort of says this is wrong, everybody's free now. It's really messy. There's a lot of collateral damage. A lot of innocent Egyptian people die. And apparently God wasn't going to do it if Moses didn't go.
I'm not sure this is in the right place to say this, but I always worked in inner cities and I was principal in really hardcore inner cities. But I remember one time a kid said to me, I forget, and I had guns in the school. A kid shot a hole in his leg and my, yeah, he did. He found a gun in the street and he brought it in, he played with it and it popped and put a hole in his foot. But I remember one day a kid said to me, the thing is, Miss Kamula, you have a really nice car and every day you leave this. You don't live here. This is not your home. And I'll never, she was so right. And if I wanted to say, I don't want to be at this school anymore. I want to be at a middle class school in Clear Lake where this kind of shit doesn't happen. Or I think. But when he said that, I just like, wow, I had nothing, I could say nothing. You don't live here, you don't have to put up with it every single day. And just walk the street and there it is. You have no place to go but to your little house, wherever it is.
That's pretty profound.
Yes,
Touched you deeper.
And I think that sometimes, things like that hit all of us every now and then. Because we're in a situation and we get out of it. Gee, I'm glad I'm not there. But there are people that are there. And, maybe that helps us to think about it, perhaps figure out ways that perhaps we can make things a little bit better in that community. Like, for example, we give Thanksgiving to families at McWhirter. That doesn't change the community, but it at least allows them at least one day of the year to have something special.
but on the other hand, I've thought in my head about going to McWhirter because of my background in inner city schools and all that. And offering to volunteer to tutor or something. Well, I've been here in this church for a while. I've never walked over to McWhirter and offered my help. I didn't. Because I thought, oh no, I've done that. I've been in those schools. But that's in itself is not,
How many
doesn't say
years-
much about me.
And how many, oh, yeah, it does. How many years did you teach?
About 30 years.
Okay.
I worked 30 years in it, and I was always in inner city schools.
And while there's not equality in our society and equity, the one institution that tries to do that the most is our educational institution. It
Yes.
tries to give every 1 through 12th grades
Right,
is offered
right.
to everybody.
Yes,
Now,
Now, I don't say it's the complete and only thing,
no, it's
but you
not
spent
perfect.
30 years trying to do that.
there was an incident when we, she has to go up and get allergy injections, and she was sitting there, and there was a guy that was getting an injection. And the person that was getting the injection called her name. And he came up and said, "Are you so-and-so?" She said, "Yes." He said, "My son was in gangs and everything else. You saved my son, and he is now married, has his own home, and is working and has children. Thank you for saving my son."
So,
I guess it
I
can be
ran
done.
inner city schools and I was pretty hard on the kids. I mean, I was wanted straightforward,
Sure.
that didn't always agree with me, but but when that man said that to me, I thought, oh my gosh. It worked for one kid.
It made a difference. That's
Somewhere
all it
worked for
takes.
one kid.
Well, I do think you put in this interesting balance, and again, I don't know necessarily how we map this onto God or not, but because I've done something before that was good. I mean, I guess I could say I'm obligated to do it again, but I don't know. I think part of what we get to think about here is like, what do we choose to do? And what does God choose to do? Or how does God choose to do things is another way of thinking about that, right? God is, as the book says, right? Like we have these ideas that God is never changing and that God is all powerful and all knowing and present everywhere at all times, right? That was in the book.
Yes,
And yet there's like some interesting contradictions, right? So like, if God's everywhere all the time, where's hell? Is God in hell?
And hell is in God, perhaps.
And then hell would have to be in God, right? Like you either have one or the other. So either God's everywhere all the time and hell exists inside of God, Or there's no God in hell, which means God can't be everywhere all the time if hell is a place.
Or perhaps hell is just an invention of us.
Could be. I did have a professor who said hell is the ulcer in God's stomach, which I thought was actually organic and clever,
Yes.
and allowed the truth of suffering to like be there. Because it's like we had that in our own bodies, right? Like in some ways it was a very embodied thought. God knows everything. But in the Bible, God keeps looking to see what people will do. So if you know everything, are you still curious? Humans tend not to be. We tend to lose curiosity when we've settled into knowing everything. So like, is God curious about what you're going to have for lunch today?
It's a way to tell the story of God.
Well, these are important themes in the story, particularly as we think about the personal God. Does God know you're going to change your mind, or does God just hope you might? And what does like true omniscience look like? Is it knowing every detail? Is it knowing the end of things? Is it knowing like the substrata of how things are made? Is it all of the above? I mean, I don't know the answer. God seems to get surprised in the Bible sometimes. And maybe that's just a story, right? But it's interesting to think about surprise. Because one of the best parts about being human, and sometimes one of the worst parts about being human, is surprise.
Yes.
And then when God negotiates and says, I'm going to kill everyone in this feet, and I forget who the prophet was, says, well, there are some righteous people here, and he said, well, if you find me 10 people, then I won't destroy the people. I mean, there is this negotiation going on all the time. So if he knows everything, then why is he negotiating?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? And do we do that? Like, do we actually change God's mind when we pray?
Yes, that's,
Because if you can't change God's mind, but ask him. Unless you're asking so that you can change your own mind. I mean, I don't know the answer.
That's sort of what's been rolling around in my head. Because I used to have a real problem with people that said they had a personal relationship, usually with Jesus.
Mhm.
And they spoke of it in a way that I found offensive. Like, I don't think Jesus can be my best friend. And this was kind of the image I was getting. And what I'm coming to, I haven't gotten it in words yet, but what I think I'm coming to is that for me, a personal relationship with God is the times when I realize that my heart is changing.
Hmm.
That I've had a judgment about a person that was unkind. And somehow I've come to think, oh, I see where that person's coming from. I see what they're experiencing. I see what they've happened. Now I feel compassion, or it's a door opening for a relationship between me and another person. And I think that's where that personal relationship with God comes in. It's the changing of my heart. That it gives the opportunity for other loving relationships.
Well, I can give a personal example of that. Weekend, we had lunch with some friends of ours who are gay, and they brought along a person that was transgender. He'd been a pilot in Vietnam. He was married for 62 years before his wife passed away. About 20 years before she passed away, they talked about that that he was a woman, and they were able to work it out, and they did a lot of volunteer work in the AIDS community downtown. But we had lunch with him. He's dressed as a woman, and I had never met someone like that before. I didn't have intellectually, I said that, that's okay, but I never actually came face to face with one.
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, it's okay. That's an okay person. And so, we talked about Vietnam because I was there, and we had a very good conversation. But later I found out that he probably has a year left to live. I come a long way in accepting people that are different than us.
And I was in the same group. I was sitting next to Tim, and he was like across the table, almost as far as you are, like, because it was kind of a big table. There were a lot of people sitting around. I didn't know any of that until Tim left, and we, our friend, who had told you about it? Roger had told you about his story. And I said hello to him, and he said, it was a pleasure meeting you, he said. And I said, thank you, same here. But none of it just, until Tim talked to me, I mean, it all just going over my head, and it was like, then you think, you live and you never know about what's happening to the person next to you, or who they are, or what kind of heartbreak they may be in the middle of, or what you just rattle on and in your own little head, and that's it. And what this guy's going through is pretty serious, and he's facing pretty hard stuff in his life.
So I think that when you say you have a personal relationship, I think personal relationship is you meet in situations and you have a change of heart. That's a God moment.
I think one of my metrics for personal relationship that I got to in marriage, and I come in and out of it, is that one of the highlights of personal relationship is I don't have to say anything to my spouse, but I'm really glad to occupy proximity with her.
Oh, yeah.
So we don't have to talk. In fact, there's times I'd rather not, but I'm really glad to be in the same space together. I easily forget that, like, oh, we're supposed to do something, but to just like be aware of somebody else's presence in the room, positively aware. It seems like not a bad way to pray to me.
No, that's beautiful, and that's really cool.
Well, I went to, because we're talking about personal God, I went to a spiritual director, this nun. A lot of spiritual directors are nuns. She was a sweet nun. She gave me lots of books to read. Many of them were really good books. And, like I came in and I totally remember where I even got this story about like what prayer was like, because it came from a youth camp I went to, where this person said that, hey, God is waiting for you to show up in prayer, like at a restaurant with a flower on the table. And because you don't ever come, you're standing God up. And so like we fundamentally just break God's heart over and over and over again. So I got this image when I was a kid. And it was such a strong image that when I would like pray with like words in my head, I would come to God with like apologies. Like, oh, I'm so sorry to leave you waiting, and I've stood you up, and you're disrespected, and you must be really mad, and I'm sorry. This sort of business. And so the nun was like, well, look, what if we just really reimagined that scene a bit? and so I was able, it took a while, but to reimagine the scene, the initial step was me sitting down and saying like, oh, I'm late and whatever, and God going, shh, like, look, I've been waiting all day, so let's just have some time now. And like, if you're gonna spend the 5 minutes we have together apologizing, I won't actually be with you, I'll just be with your apologies. So what if we just didn't do those for the sake of us having some time? That was helpful for me.
Yes.
Difficult though, because I had to give up God being angry and disrespected and hurt, and to give that up, or it wouldn't have worked. Maybe God does have those feelings and chooses to give them up. I mean, I don't know. There's times I choose to give those up with my own family, kids and friends, right? Like, boy, I've got lots of good reasons to be very indignant, and I've chosen to give that up for the sake of the relationship. I don't know. That seems pretty personal to me.
Mhm.
If I could read my writing, this meant a lot to me, but I have a hard time. And I don't know whether it came out of this book or out of one of the Bible readings, but it says, in many instances, I have felt the power of God transforming the fatigue of despair into the buoyancy of hope. And I really love that. I reread it, and then I wrote it, and I hope that buoyancy is the right word. But I was writing so quickly. But anyway, that was in some of this, and that, I like this. You know, that kind of sums up what I feel about God and my relationship, that he has brought me out of the pits of despair and given me hope in many situations. And I just had to write that down.
I wrote it down too.
Did you? You wrote it down? Well, where did it come from?
Martin Luther King.
Okay, it came from Martin Luther
Oh,
King
my
in the
goodness.
reading. Okay, that's where it came from.
Can you, this is off the subject, but in one of the, George Harkness, he talks about the Doctrine of Providence. What is that?
Is that reading 63?
57?
57.
It's just, he just says that in a sentence, Doctrine of Providence, and I didn't get a chance to look it up and just,
Oh, yeah. So it's the bottom of page 50. The idea of, I mean, providence really is about God's ultimately in control. And like what that word control means is very vexing, right? Allows everything to happen, engineers, could change if wanted to.
so the Doctrine of Providence is just the belief that God's in control.
But my seminary teacher who talked about the hell being an ulcer in God's stomach is also gave me the line that God is the helpless superior power.
Helpless?
Helpless.
Oh, helpless.
And that the way that God has chosen to be personal is by surrendering control.
Yes.
And what's interesting, like the doctrine says, God could take it up again, but then it would be impersonal. In my own head, that's kind of how I reconcile the two natures of Jesus, is that the divine nature submits to the human nature and never overwhelms it. So if Jesus walked in the room and read everybody's mind, he wasn't a human being, period, for me. So I know he says, like, I know what you're thinking. And we always think, oh, Jesus is a mind reader. There's times I know what people are thinking. I'm not a mind reader. If Jesus did miracles, he was not a human being. If God did miracles through Jesus, he still gets to be human. You think about the people in the Bible who do miracles. They don't do it. God does it. And somehow they're physically around. They're bystanders or they help broker that, but it's not their power. So maybe Jesus stands in that line. Because if he could do it, he wasn't human. Now that's a heck of a contradiction, isn't it?
It helps with the Trinity. understanding.
And we're gonna spend a whole time on the, did anybody read that Robert Capon thing I sent down about the Trinity having like a banquet and they threw olives at each other and that's where the world came from? I sent that in an email last week. It was like way too fun for me to think could possibly be real. Because usually God must be very serious. I'm sure one of the members of the Trinity is very serious. But I would bet another one of the members of the Trinity is not.
Could you resend that? I don't.
Yeah. I don't
Yeah, I'm
think
happy to
you
send
got
it again.
Yeah, I read that.
It was weird, right?
Yeah.
It was weird. And yet what I liked about it is the idea, instead of the Trinity like getting together in a very somber and quiet and dark environment to make plans, the universe was a celebration. Now, I know my Enneagram personality, and like in the old word, I'm like pretty choleric, right? So I don't do things out of celebrations. I just don't. So to imagine God doing that is like, come on, grow up. But it's interesting to think, because we all know people who are spontaneous and like have these kinds of parties. So maybe one of the members of the Trinity is like that. The other two can be as serious as you want to be. It's interesting if you've read The Shack, and the book The Shack talks
Oh,
about God
yes.
showing up really in controversial ways so that your understanding of God will grow. And sure enough, says, yeah, a lot of people have easy time with Jesus because he was a human being historically. So we can picture that. And in the book, God the Father shows up as a very large Black woman. And the Holy Spirit shows up as this quiet, artsy Asian woman, which is just sort of interesting. And the author says, God did that for my sake. Not because God is those things, but because I didn't see God in those places. That's exactly where God showed up, so I would. C.S. Lewis says it a little differently. He says God is the great iconoclast, the breaker of images. So anytime we settle into a comfortable image of God, God tries really hard to break it for our sake, which can feel very painful because we've settled and God is saying, I am bigger than that thing you've settled for. So how about we break that? That is very much part of my Enneagram personality, is to do different things for the sake of doing different things. You've been to church more than once here, or you've seen that. So
I also wonder if part of the way that we see God isn't just about how, or well, whether we see him or it, whatever, this way, or if it's not the way that God chooses to show up in people's lives doesn't have to do with just our need, like someone who is maybe missing the type of like loving embrace that you get from a father who is vulnerable with you, who's close with you, who shares himself with you. Maybe a part of you is really missing that in some way. The idea of God as a best friend is the most comforting thing you can imagine. So that's how you imagine God, and that's how God shows up in your life. But if, the idea of a God who's really close to you and someone who is, not taking on this more serious role of the creator of the universe, who doesn't have time to be best friends with every single one of us, is that kind of great mind and heart that is taking it and everything from this eagle eye view. If that's the thing that's comforting, then maybe that's how God shows up in your life. Because I feel like even over time in my own life, just the way that I see God and the way that I think about having a, kind of what Ellen was talking about, a relationship with God is vastly different just from decade to decade. And I think that had a lot to do with just who I needed God to be, or maybe, the peace, face, image of God, how God revealed himself to me. It just like I was the one that was changing. And I don't know if God changes or not, but I know that I absolutely do. And so, yeah, and I also really have a lot of respect for what some other people were saying about, the times in which you see God or the times in which you watch yourself change. And I just think that's really beautiful. And, maybe it's a gift that as we see God in our lives through our own changes for, the betterment and refinement and edification, we also understand God differently or more fully or, whatever as we go along.
Well, thanks. And I think that has a little bit to do, I think we talked about maybe 2 weeks ago, I'd read a rabbinic read that sometimes the Torah will sort of put up with social institutions that it hates, but try to change the values of those institutions so that as we grow, we will get rid of them. Because the rabbis say the Torah, in order to be perfect, has to meet us where we are and take us to where God wants us to go at the same time, right? And as an educator, we say, hey, that's all about building a scaffolding. You can't make a schematic change most of the time without like steps to get you there. Very few people are good at making 20-foot vertical leaps. So instead they need some stairs or some handholds to help them get, and this is the education word scaffolding, to get you at a schema change, right? And so perhaps it's not that God has changed in scripture, it's that as we continue, we're the ones who have changed as we understand God, and that is in scriptures. And let's not pretend like changes are permanent. I often like have really good habits that I let go of. And so this is an interesting thing to sort of think about, I think, Amber, how that ultimately, how that kind of works. And I would say, like, when we think about best friend, my best friends are not the ones actually who are always like lovey-dovey. Sometimes what they say is, I love you too much for you to stay where you are. I love you exactly as you are, and I love you too much to leave you there.
Yeah, my best friends are the people who offer me truth with compassion.
Yeah, it became really helpful in my marriage relationship to realize one day my wife is telling me things she wants me to change because she believes I can. Not because I'm driving her crazy with my inability. She sees I can do this thing that I don't see I can do. And she's saying, be yourself. Do this thing. That's an interesting way of personal friendship. I'm suspicious God has that quality of friendship with us. It's personal. Maybe one last thought, because I'd be remiss if I didn't share this in my own head. We talked. He mentioned language and involvement in history, and obviously language is really important to me. And I think there's a book that we had to read as seminarians called "Praying Shapes Believing." That is, the words we use generate what we believe, and not usually the opposite. So it's nitpicking to say, instead of saying, God, please be with me right now, like the more theologically sophisticated statement is, God, I know you're with me, and I really could use some more awareness of that. Right? We don't pray like that, and that shapes how we think, because that means there are vacuums where God doesn't exist. God, come be with me, please, means God isn't with me. So the nuancing maybe is important, right? And when we talk about God in male pronouns only, you can say, oh, but I don't think God has a gender. I just use he language because it's convenient. I think that's delusional. I do. As human beings, we understand through our words. We just do. And I read this really interesting article yesterday, Jim McGill sent me, about how the Trinity is queer. Not sexually, but doesn't fit categories. 3 and 1, that sounds like schizophrenia. That's by definition of the word queer, that's queer. So this article was saying, like, look, queer theology really originates, it's Trinitarian. So it's interesting to think about that. Last thought, and you can read this in 2 different books. Perhaps you've read this in high school, Elie Wiesel's book, Night. And then there's another book that I have referred to a couple times since I've been here called Proverbs of Ashes. It's a difficult book. But both of these books have to do with, like, where is God in the Holocaust? And in Proverbs of Ashes, this woman is abused by a neighbor. And she spends her whole life saying like, God, where were you? And at the conclusion of the book, she realizes like God was with her when she was being abused. And not stopping the abuser, but pleading with the abuser to stop. And in Night, there's this little boy that's hanged because he's stolen food or something like this. And it's gruesome. It takes him hours to die. And somebody in the crowd, they all have to watch this as a potential deterrent, says, where is God? And Elie Wiesel says, there he is, right there, in the noose. And you could interpret that, I guess, as Elie Wiesel saying God is dead, or you could interpret it as the personal God dies with us.
Is that K-N-I-G-H-T or?
No, just the letter N.
N-I-G.
It's a 3-part series, he writes. N-I-G-H-T, there's like night, dawn, and morning, I
Oh,
think.
okay.
And most high
Okay,
school
okay.
curricula only use the first one, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is what it's about. And then the other ones go on after the war to how Rabbi Wiesel makes sense of all of this, right? So it's interesting to think, what is God's response to evil? The personal God suffers it. Hey, I think that does us for time. Thanks for being here. And next week we'll talk about Providence.
Really?
Yeah, we really will. Fortuitous that you asked about it.
I didn't look ahead.